Hi everybody, welcome. My name is Peter J. Ray. Yo homies, what's up you demand? Today's topic is George Washington Part 2. So briefly, in Part 1 we talked about George Washington's early life growing up in Virginia and the death of his father when he was 11 years old, and then how he had to start working when he was 15. From age 15 to 20, he worked as a surveyor, and from age 20 to 26, he served as a soldier in the British Army and saw action in Virginia and western Pennsylvania, fighting the French and their Indian allies. From age 26 to 42, he worked as a farmer at his home on Mount Vernon in Virginia, and he married a young widow named Martha Dandridge Custis, who had 2 young children, and he was a father to them, a stepfather. So he was farming. He had slaves and who were working on the farm with him. He also was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses legislative body, so he was into politics. So that brings us up to 1770, when he was he was 48 years old. I think that's right, 48, no? 1732, well, whatever. 1770, can't do the math very well here. Now, there were growing problems with Great Britain, the colonial power, and the 13 colonies, English colonies in North America, and specifically in Boston. Boston was really the center of rebellion against British abuses and arbitrary actions by the British. And in 1770, the Boston Massacre took place. And this Boston had been under military occupation. There was a lot of tension between British soldiers and citizens in Boston, American citizens, especially young men. And in this incident in question, there was a soldier who was being insulted, a British soldier insulted by some young Americans. And it escalated. He called for help. He got about 10 other British soldiers with him, and then a big crowd grew around them, like maybe 200 people. And this crowd of Americans was insulting the soldiers, throwing snowballs at them, throwing oyster shells, and threatening them. And they had guns facing this crowd. It's not a good idea to insult a man who has a gun trained on you. And anyway, the soldiers fired into the crowd. 5 Americans were killed. They called it the Boston Massacre. Well, it served as propaganda purposes for those who wanted a war of independence against Great Britain. But, and so as I said, Boston is where all the resistance was taking place. And that's why the New England Patriots, who are the NFL team in Boston, are very well named. And people in Boston can be very proud that they pretty much started the American Revolution. Okay, so now since the facts of the Boston Massacre really were ambivalent, John Adams, who became the 2nd president and actually was a big leader in the American Revolution, he actually served as the lawyer and defended the British soldiers in court, because he believed, that actually they had been provoked and their lives were at stake. Okay. In 1773, Martha's daughter, Patsy, died. Now this was really tough for her and for George, because George had raised her from young childhood. She had had epilepsy and died having an epileptic seizure, so this was tough. She'd had a tough life, and she'd received very poor medical care, because back then medical care was bad. They didn't know how to help someone with epilepsy. So that left the son, Jack, who was still alive, the son of Martha, and he was a ne'er-do-well, kind of a lazy guy, and George had a lot of struggles with him, because George, was a very hard worker, and it was very hard for him to try to raise Jack, who didn't really want to work, wanted to have fun, and so forth. By this time, Jack was a young man, and he had a fiancée named Nellie Calvert, who became like a daughter to Martha, and eventually they got married. Okay, in 1773, as I said, the New England Patriots are well named. The Boston Tea Party took place on December 16th. 300 expensive chests of imported tea were dumped in Boston Harbor from a ship that was anchored. Okay, and this was in protest to the tax on tea that the British had imposed. The British retaliated. This was a real step toward war and the destruction of property. And as a result, two guys involved in that were Paul Revere and Sam Adams. Well, Sam Adams was a cousin of John Adams and was a big leader in the American Revolution. Well, the British responded by closing Boston Harbor. And that was a disaster for the people of Boston, because it was a shipping town. They were required on trade, and then as a result, ships weren't allowed in and out of Boston. So things were deteriorating. The following year, leaders among the colonies decided to have a meeting to get together and talk about how they should deal with the British abuses. And so there was a meeting called the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Philadelphia was centrally located and a major city. And they decided as a result of that meeting to boycott trade with Great Britain. Now, Boston really was almost in a state of war, because there was all of this, the British military presence was very heavy, and the people in Massachusetts were preparing for war, and there were various incidents of violence. Now, there was an interesting meeting took place in Virginia in March of 1775 with the Virginia leaders trying to decide what they should do about the situation. And at that meeting, March 20th, 1775, Patrick Henry gave a famous speech. And I'll repeat part of it here. "Gentlemen may cry, 'Peace, peace,' but there is no peace. The war is actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty, or give me death." Famous quote that we are familiar with from childhood, or at least we used to be. They used to teach that in schools. Anyway, so the following month, in April of 1775, the British military governor, Thomas Gage, in Boston, the governor of Massachusetts, he had learned that the Americans were collecting weapons and preparing to fight. So he learned that those weapons were at Concord, Massachusetts. So he prepared a group of British soldiers to travel to Concord, Massachusetts, to capture these weapons and to arrest Sam Adams and John Hancock. John Hancock became famous, is famous for his very large and legible signature on the Declaration of Independence. Okay. So, this is when the famous midnight ride of Paul Revere took place, when he was warning people the British are coming. Now, the people he was speaking with were citizen soldiers, farmers, merchants, teachers, ministers, and who were called Minutemen. And because they were prepared to stop working and pick up their guns in a minute and fight the British. Now, 80 years later, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, a famous poet, wrote a wonderful poem about Paul Revere's midnight ride, called Paul Revere's Ride. "Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. He said to his friend, 'If the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the North Church Tower as a signal light, one if by land and two if by sea. And I on the opposite shore will be, ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm, for the country folk to be up in arm. So through the night rode Paul Revere, and so through the night went his cry of alarm to every Middlesex village and farm, a cry of defiance and not of fear, a voice in the darkness, a knock on the door, and a word that shall echo never evermore. For born on the night wind of the past, through all our history to the last, in the hour of darkness and peril and need, the people will waken and listen to hear the hurrying hoofbeats of that steed and the midnight message of Paul Revere. Very wonderful poem. Okay, so that same month, the Revolution started, the American War of Independence, by the 13 English colonies in North America against Great Britain. April 19th, remember the British were coming, but the weapons at Concord were secured. Sam Adams and John Hancock were able to get away, but fighting started at Lexington, what was known as the shots heard round the world, and fighting at Concord and Lexington, Massachusetts. And during that fighting, 70 British soldiers were killed and 170 wounded, 20 miles west of Boston. Meanwhile, in Vermont, Ethan Allen and the so-called Green Mountain Boys captured Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain in New York Colony, later state, from the British. And Ethan Allen reportedly said when they were able to take this fort, quote, "You must surrender in the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress." So in May of 75, really the war was starting, and George Washington was in Philadelphia for another Continental Congress. And he spoke at that meeting. They were trying to decide what to do. And George Washington said, quote, "Unhappy it is to reflect that a brother's sword has been sheathed in a brother's breast, and that the once happy and peaceful plains of America are either to be drenched in blood or inhabited by slaves. Sad alternative. But can a virtuous man hesitate in his choice? Shall we, after this, whine and cry for relief when we have already tried in vain? Or shall we supinely sit and see one province after another fall prey to despotism?" So he's trying to say that what the British were doing to Massachusetts could happen all over, in all the colonies. So a decision was made in June of 1775 that a Continental Army, an American army, needed to be formed and would be formed. And then the question is, who would lead that? Who would lead that army? George Washington was a pretty quiet man. He had a very strong spirit. He was very humble. He had 6 years of military experience, and he was from the South. So there was a desire to create unity between the North and the South, since the war was starting as a Northern rebellion. So the decision was made. John Adams lobbied hard for George Washington to be named commander of the Continental Congress, and he was named and accepted on the condition that he would serve without pay. He was not paid for his service. And I think he really should have been paid, because later he had severe financial problems because he spent 8.5 years without being paid for very hard work that he did. So now just to give you a little geography here, these 13 colonies on the Atlantic coast of North America: Massachusetts, where the war started; Virginia, which had the largest population and economy; Pennsylvania, which had the largest city, Philadelphia; New York; New Jersey, between Philadelphia and New York City; Maryland, between Philadelphia and Virginia; and then the lesser colonies, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Delaware, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. So after receipt, George had traveled from Mount Vernon in Virginia to Philadelphia. Now Martha expected him to come home. He wrote her a letter and said, "I will not be coming home. Martha, I'm sorry." And because of this position that he had been appointed to, and so he traveled from Philadelphia to Boston to take command of the American Army in Boston, the Continental Army. Now, while he was traveling, he received news of the first major battle of the war, the Battle of Bunker Hill, and he got the news on June 17th. Now, the American commander at Bunker Hill was General Israel Putnam, and Israel Putnam was actually in Rocky River, Ohio, or what became Rocky River, Ohio, just across the street from where I'm living here at Beechcliff Place Apartments in Rocky River. Across the street is Bradstreet Landing Park, and that's where 12 years before the Battle of Bunker Hill, John Bradstreet was the British commander leading British forces across Lake Erie by sea, in the lake, to supposedly awe or intimidate Pontiac and the Indians near Detroit who had been fighting, who had been rebelling. On the way back, they had a storm. They had to stop here in what's this park across the street, Bradstreet Landing Park, and then they continued onward to the east. So I wrote a letter to Rocky River Mayor Pam Bopst, suggesting that the park be renamed after Israel Putnam, because he was the hero of the Battle of Bunker Hill, and John Bradstreet was a British officer with whom we eventually became enemies. Of course, later we became friends. Now, before the Battle of Bunker Hill, Israel Putnam had told the troops this famous quote, "Don't fire, boys, until you see the whites of their eyes." That's a well-known quote. Now, in this major battle, 440 Americans were killed or wounded, and more than 1,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded. George Washington arrived in the Boston area on July 2nd, and he took command of the American Army. The British Army was in Boston, and the American Army was in Cambridge, outside. So, and as the months passed, there actually was no fighting. There was a standoff. Neither side attacked. So Washington was very busy organizing the army, training, and disciplining the soldiers. And so what had been a Massachusetts rebel army had become an American army, what they called the Continental Army. His headquarters were in Cambridge. Washington forbade cursing and drunkenness. Off-duty men were required to go to church on Sunday, quote, "to implore the blessings of heaven upon the means used for our safety and defense." Now, Washington had overwhelming problems. The first major problem he had was a severe gunpowder shortage. And if the British had attacked, they would have easily defeated the Americans, but they didn't. And it took 3 months before they finally had enough gunpowder so that Washington felt secure about that. However, there was no money. There was a shortage of money to pay the troops, shortage of food, clothing, and blankets. And the entire army was set to disband at the end of the year because all of the enlistments of the men ended December 31. So Washington was facing the dissolution of his army. Now, another point here is that Washington brought a slave, Billy Lee, who was one of his African-American slaves who was a servant and was his constant companion during the war. So God bless Billy Lee. During the standoff in Boston on October 24th, news arrived in Boston that the British had burned the town of Falmouth, Maine, the whole town, leaving the entire town homeless on the eve of winter. Now, one of the things Washington had to do, well, excuse me, okay, is he had to constantly recruit men to fight in the war, because guys were always, they had these short enlistments. So Washington gave a speech in October asking the men, hoping that they would change their minds or they would re-enlist at the end of the year. And he said this, quote, "The times and the importance of the great cause we are engaged in allow no room for hesitation and delay. When life, liberty, and property are at stake, when our country is in danger of being a melancholy scene of bloodshed and desolation, when our towns are laid in ashes, innocent women and children driven from their peaceful habitations, exposed to the rigor of an inclement season, and to the hands of charity, perhaps for a support, when calamities like these are staring us in the face, and a brutal, savage enemy are threatening us and everything we hold dear with destruction from foreign troops, it little becomes the character of a soldier to shrink from danger." Now, an important point to remember, or to know, is that during the war, 5,000 African American soldiers served in the Continental Army. So that's a very important point to remember. So African Americans can feel very proud of the role their ancestors played in the United States becoming an independent country from Great Britain. Washington had real hard times. In December, he wrote, quote, "I have met with difficulties such as I never expected, but they must be borne with. The cause we are engaged in is so just and righteous that we must try to rise superior to every obstacle in its support." In December, his wife Martha arrived in Cambridge for the winter with their son Jack and his wife Nellie. Now, the war lasted 8.5 years. For 5 of those years, Martha was with the Army. Okay, so she definitely played her part. She played her part in the war because she wanted to be supportive, and she would come every winter, spend the winter, and go back and spend the summer at Mount Vernon. So during the war, one of the hardest things was keeping the morale up of the troops, because guys were very discouraged over many things, over, like I said, lack of pay, lack of not enough food, lack of clothing, and so it was very tough to keep the morale up. So George Washington, that was one of the things that he did, was to instill hope and a positive attitude, and so George kept the morale up of the Army. Now Martha kept his morale up, because I know he became very discouraged at times. He had overwhelming problems, unbelievable problems that he faced. Now, besides lifting his spirits, she also, during these times she spent, would visit with soldiers and meet with them, especially the wounded, to help keep up their morale. They called Martha Washington the secret weapon of the American Revolution. She was a wonderful woman, really an amazing woman. She deserves to be mentioned or to be talked about. There's a good book about her. Martha wrote this in 1775, quote, "I am determined to be cheerful and to be happy in whatever situation I may be. For I have also learned from experience that the greater part of our happiness or misery depends upon our disposition and not upon our circumstances. We carry the seeds of the one or the other with us in our minds wherever we go." Now you have to remember, she was, she loved staying at home. They had a lovely home, and she came, and this is not what she wanted, to spend all this time, half the year, more than half the year with the American Army, wherever it might be. And it was, they traveled, they were all over the place. So that was not what she wanted, but you can see she was fighting to stay positive, and she did. So she's a hero of the American Revolution. In December, again, there was no fighting in Boston. There was this standoff that continued. And Americans started looking at Canada, which was still under British control, and they thought, wow, look at all that land. Let's take it. And it reminds me of It reminds me, well, okay. So Americans invaded Canada, and the invasion was led by Benedict Arnold and Daniel Morgan. Now it kind of reminds me of the time when when France was a very powerful country in the early 1800s, and Napoleon looked at Russia and said, wow, look at all that land, let's take it. And later in the Second World War, Adolf Hitler looked at the Soviet Union, which was the new name of Russia, and he said, wow, let's take it. Look at all that land. Well, all three of these failed. The American invasion of Canada and the French and German invasions of Russia. And for the same reasons. Because of long distances that the men had to march and because of the severe cold weather. So that's interesting. In January, half of the Army did re-enlist. So the Army had dwindled, but at least the Army did not completely dissolve. Washington said at this time, quote, I have scarcely emerged from one difficulty before I have plunged into another. How it will end, God in His great goodness will direct. I am thankful for His protection at this time. The reflection upon my situation and that of this army produces many an uneasy hour when all around me are wrapped in sleep. Few people know the predicament we are in. See, he was facing a very tough, it's hard to believe what he went through. Now another important thing, the British, their generals bought their positions. A lot of them were lords, they were rich men. They wanted to be a general, and so that's how the leadership of the British was achieved. And that's not a good way to get good leadership. Now the Americans, on the other hand, it was purely merit-based. If you could lead men in battle, if you had courage and intelligence and strength, you could be a leader. So a lot of guys who were really nobody became generals in the American Revolution. And this is the story of America. You know, people who come here from all over the world who might be very poor, have no family name, and because of hard work and perseverance and intelligence and good character, they succeed in the United States. So in the war, the Americans had the big advantage in terms of leadership. Again, throughout the war, Washington's problems for all 8 years were short enlistments, so he was constantly, new guys were constantly coming in who had to be given weapons and needed to be trained and so forth. In January of '76, the British bombed and burned Norfolk, Virginia, for refusing to give provisions to British troops. Now, the war was controversial. It was said that 1/3 of Americans supported the war, 1/3 were against the war, and 1/3 were undecided. Now, in January of 1776, a very important book was released, a short book called Common Sense, and it was written by Thomas Paine. And this book made a very powerful argument in favor of the war, and had a major effect on changing public opinion. Now, in the last several years, Glenn Beck came out with his own Common Sense, and he makes reference to that book and the role it played back then, and how we need some of those same ideas today. Now, also in January, a Boston bookseller, really a nobody, a guy who was a nobody, and a self-taught artillery expert named Henry Knox approached General George Washington with an idea, with a wonderful idea. He said, you know, General Washington, we can go to Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain in New York State, and we can get those cannons there and transport them by sled over Lake Champlain and by sled all the way here to Boston, and put them at Dorchester Heights, which are at a high point, and train those guns on the British positions in Boston. And Washington said, hey, great idea. And that's exactly what they did. Henry Knox, again, he was a nobody, and he was a major hero in the American Revolution. So it was a tough thing they did. All those cannons were brought. The British one day in March, woke up and they saw these cannons facing them, and they thought, oh my God, we're in big trouble here. So they sent a message to Washington they wanted to communicate. Thanks for watching. God bless you. God bless America, the Philippines, and the whole world. See you next time.